Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let all of our attendees and all of our participants come online. So bear with us and give us a few minutes before we begin our program. Okay, I think we are ready. We are live on YouTube. Thank you, Roy Regev, who is giving me some information via chat. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Sinai Temple and the Sinai Temple Israel Center, we're so pleased to welcome you this evening, where we get to have this wonderful, intimate chat with Dr. Hillel Newman, our Consul General to the Pacific Southwest. We wanted to let everyone know this is being exclusively streamed on YouTube. And so throughout the conversation tonight, if you have questions, you can feel free to put the questions into the chat on YouTube. And Rebecca Small, our program director, will glean the questions and send the questions our way. And we're also going to ask you, because everything on the chat is really a conversation with all of you, the participants. We don't actually see the chat itself. Please keep the conversation respectful and civil, and we will do our best to answer what's on your mind. And so to begin, just want to thank, of course, Dr. Newman for giving us your time, for addressing our Sinai Temple community and beyond, and a little bit of information about you. Dr. Hillel Newman assumed the post of Consul General of Israel in July 2019, where he serves as the senior representative of the state of Israel to the Pacific Southwest. And maybe you'll share a little bit later as to exactly what that entails. Consul General Newman is a highly respected author, academic, and statesman. Dr. Newman's diplomatic experience includes serving as a policy advisor to 3 foreign ministers. And I think you'll explain a little bit later all of the different places that you've served. I want you to save that as part of the journey. But most recently as both special policy advisor to the Director General and as director of the World Jewish Affairs Department, Consul General Newman has been intimately involved in the most current and pressing issues on the global Jewish agenda. He's also has a unique overview of the strategic threats facing Israel, which is exactly what we will be discussing this evening, playing a key role in the strategic division of the foreign ministry. He made Aliyah to Israel with his family as a young man from South Africa, served as a medic in the IDF, and is married to Ayala. And the couple have a 10-year-old son. Is he 10 now?
He's already 11.
That's what I figured. 11 years old, Ram. And so we are so pleased to have you, Dr. Newman. I have many questions to ask you. We're going to turn the spotlight over to you as you give us a general overview of the many, many topics we threw your way in the description for this evening, a general overview of what's happening in Israel, certainly anti-Semitism here in Los Angeles, and I'll let you take it away from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Guzik. Let me open with special gratitude to you, Rabbi Guzik, and the entire team and the community, the Sinai Temple community, and of course, Carolyn from our consulate, who have all brought this to come to be. I have a special warm place in my heart for the Sinai Temple community because I know that it's a community which is dedicated, committed to Jewish values, to the state of Israel, value-orientated community. And for that reason, it's my pleasure to be with you this evening. As you mentioned, I'll try to give just like an overview of different issues that are on our agenda. And then I'll be glad to take questions and you can ask whatever you want. Okay, well, look, I mean, the burning issue is the elections in Israel. We can't ignore that, right? So I'll start off with that. And we've been through 2 years, 4 campaigns, and we finally have a government. And there are quite a few precedents in this government. It's quite groundbreaking, one could say. First of all, you have 8 parties coming together, which is a wide, diverse joining of forces. I say diverse because it's left, far left even, with right, coming together. And it's not really a national unity government. I'll talk about that soon. But it's a coming together of very diverse forces. The second thing, which is quite unprecedented, is that the Prime Minister, Bennett, is the leader of a very small party in the Knesset. He only has 7 members of parliament in his party, and he's actually now down to 6 because one of them decided not to support the government. So he's actually the leader of one of the smaller parties. But it's a matter of coalition coming together. As I said, the system in Israel is very different. So it's a coalition building, and this is the coalition that was built. Also, this idea of alternate prime minister, which means that Lapid will come in 2023 as prime minister. Another aspect which is unique is the fact that it's a religious prime minister. And the fourth thing that I would stress is the Arab party. It's the first time that you have an Arab party part of the coalition. The positive things about it is that we're going to go, we have relative stability. Now we have at last a government. We have relative unity, consensus issues, which enjoy like a wide consensus, which are coming together. Diaspora issues will be on a high priority. Pluralism will be a high priority issue in this government. There are a few things which I would say, I wouldn't say negative, but disadvantages or perhaps challenges facing this government. And those are the following. First of all, they enjoy a very narrow majority. I mean, the vote went through on 50-49, 60-59, which is, they enjoy a majority of 61 opposing 59. That's a very, very narrow majority. And it instills a lot of skepticism of what is the longevity of this government. There's also the common denominator of these different diverse parties means that there's not much that the government can do because there are a lot of contradictions between the parties on every issue. From peace, I mean, you've got Meretz on the left and you've got Bennett who represents the right. And you're even on LGBTQ issues, you've got the Arab Party, which is against promoting equality in this aspect. So you've got a lot of contradictions. Just today, it was clear that we were going to a big issue now with Shaked, who's now the minister. She's pushing forward a law on the aspect of banning uniting of families between the Palestinians and the Arab population. And that is a big issue that was not allowed before. And she doesn't have a majority in her own government to preserve this law. So she has to rely on the opposition, which is the Likud, in order to pass this law. So that just shows the difficult situation. Future significance of this type of a government is that we're talking about a creation of a large center in Israel, in the politics of Israel. And the second thing I'll mention is that the focus is all domestic, really, and not foreign issues, not security. There's a kind of a consensus on those issues. Now, whoever comes in, I mean, we have a government now, they face the same challenges as before. And the number one challenge is the aspect of the enemies that face Israel. We have the Hezbollah on the northern border, Gaza and the Hamas on the southern border. We've just been through a war. We've been attacked on several fronts. And this government will have to address this issue as well. It's I wouldn't say it's the most existential threat to Israel. Iran is still the existential threat to Israel if they have nuclear capability. But it is, of course, a traumatizing thing that you have terrorist organizations on your border that can launch rockets against the civilian population of Israel at any time. So this is an issue. Even today, there were balloons, incendiary balloons that continued to be sent, and there were more than 20 fires around in what's called the envelope of Gaza. And the government has to decide whether they respond, how harsh they respond. This is an issue which is ongoing. In the war with Hamas, there were a few successes of Israel, which of course is the fact that we managed to diminish the stocks, the rocket stocks. We managed to take out most of the production lines of the rockets. We hit at many of the terrorists, but we also had strategic challenges. And the strategic challenges were the fact that a terrorist organization like that can traumatize more than 5 million civilians in Israel just by launching rockets. And the question is, okay, so how do you deal with that? What is the long-term solution? And that raises the issue, okay, do we take over Gaza again? Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to rule the lives of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Nobody wants to renew any kind of occupation. So these are the issues which we're facing. And we can talk about that at length if we want. As I said, Iran is the biggest threat, and Iran is behind everything. They're also behind the resistance to the normalization of relations with the Arab world. We should mention, of course, that over the past year, we have normalized relations with an additional 4 Arab states, which is wonderful. It's very significant. In fact, it's in many ways, it has a special significance beyond the Egypt and Jordan agreements that we have. And it withstood the biggest test. The biggest test that we had to this relationship was now with the war with Hamas. The Hamas, no doubt, wanted to reverse this and bring about some of the states cutting their ties with Israel. None of them did, and none of them cut their ties with Israel. They all continued. And now we hope that further states will join this issue. The biggest issue that Israel is dealing with, of course, is the economy, the repercussions of the COVID-19, and also anti-Semitism is on our agenda. We've seen Jews attacked in Los Angeles. We see synagogues and kosher restaurants being vandalized. This is an issue of grave concern for Israel. We say that just like Jews or Israelis are attacked indiscriminately in Israel, so also Jews are attacked indiscriminately in the streets of LA. And people should understand the direct link between these two issues. Jews are being attacked for being Jews. Israelis also, they were attacked not because of anything that they did or didn't do. There's a lot of falsifications and false PR, which I'll also be glad to answer if anybody wants to ask. We have, in this battle, we have 2 fronts. One is the physical front and the other one is the PR front. And we have to deal with that simultaneously or parallelly. But it has nothing to do with what Israel did or didn't do, just like the attacks on Jews on the streets. It's nothing to do with what they did or didn't do. It's just a matter of anti-Semitism and hatred. So these are the issues which are on the agenda. I can mention many more, just to give an overview of what's on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oof, okay, in terms of where we start. So, I mean, I definitely want to jump into all of the issues, but before we do that, Dr. Newman, I feel as if because of COVID, our community hasn't had the privilege and blessing of really getting to know you and a little bit of your journey. And so you're an incredible educator, an incredible connection to Israel. Tell us a little bit about your own journey to your current position when you talk about in terms of the entire region that you represent. Speak a little bit to that.
Sure. My journey, okay, I was born actually in South Africa. I made Aliyah, immigrated with my parents when I was a teenager. I grew up in Israel, in Netanya, actually a coast city on the shores. Very similar to where I was in South Africa. I grew up in Sea Point, Cape Town, on the beach, on the shore. So I grew up in Israel. I did graduated. I studied at a yeshiva high school, Yeshivat Tichonit, as it's called in Hebrew. And then I joined the Hesder program. My father was a rabbi. He was the rabbi of one of the spiritual leader of one of the largest communities in South Africa. And he came to Israel in order to run the conversion ulpan, which was under Rabbi Goren. It was the only conversion place in Israel at the time. And for that, he made Aliyah. He was just looking for a position in Israel. Once that was offered, we made Aliyah. And so I went to Hesder. I did 5-year military plus yeshiva studies mixed together. Everyone thought I would be a rabbi, but but I didn't go that direction. And I started academic studies. I studied for a PhD, finished a PhD in Jewish history, and then I started teaching at Bar Ilan University. I taught at Bar Ilan for about 4 or 5 years before I wasn't even thinking about a diplomatic career. And then things I won't go into the details, but things brought me to a new career. And if you want to ask about it, I'll answer, of course. But so I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about 21 years ago. This is my second career. And I was very lucky, actually, because I was accepted to the diplomatic corps. And from my cadet course, usually you're sent to one of the most difficult countries, and you're like, the smallest pawn in the system. But I was appointed as a policy advisor in the office of the foreign minister. And I worked for a year and a half with the foreign minister. I was in the most intimate discussions. So it was a wonderful experience. And then I was sent to Boston as Deputy Consul General. And before I came back, I was asked to return to the office of the foreign minister. And I went back and I worked with another 2 additional foreign ministers as their policy advisor. It was a fascinating period. And then I was sent as ambassador in Uzbekistan. And I served for 5 years in Tashkent, a Muslim country. And I was responsible for 2 countries, actually, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. And when I returned, then I went into the strategic division, and then I was roped in as the policy advisor to the Director General of our foreign ministry. It's like the Director General of the State Department is the highest professional level, below the political level. And I worked with him until I was appointed here as Consul General in Los Angeles. So I've had a very interesting career, very different type of career. And here as in Los Angeles, we're responsible for the Pacific Southwest, which means we cover not only Southern California, but an additional 6 states of the United States, which are the surrounding area, like, Wyoming, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, that area going down to the border with Mexico. That's it.
Yeah, that's it. When you listed that group of states, I don't think any of us realize the extent of the region that you cover. And I just want to then jump into what I'm sure you work on the most, and that is, I shouldn't say the most, but certainly spend a lot of time on, and that's the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I'm curious, I think many of us noticed that President Biden immediately called Bennett to congratulate him on leading the new government. And in seeing that immediacy, I'm wondering how you would characterize watching that as kind of the first steps with this new government. How do you characterize the Israel-U.S. relationship with this launch, if you will, of a new government?
Well, the relationship between Israel and the United States is beyond any party or individual. It's stronger, it's based on fundamental values. And I think there's widespread understanding that Israel is the strongest ally of the United States, and Israel feels that the United States is Israel's best friend. So it should be mutual. And I can tell you that if you look at both parties, Democratic and Republican, then the mainstream of both parties are extremely supportive of Israel. Sometimes we are distracted by periphery groups that are very noisy and very outspoken, but the vast majority of the United States at the elected official level, electoral level, and also the popular level, support Israel and support the relationship between Israel and the United States. So we should not forget that. I mean, we should be aware of what's going on. We follow very closely, and we're aware of the fact that there are periphery groups that are critical of the relationship and try to, for instance, condition the aid to Israel or all kinds of policy issues. And we've had bills like that in the Congress, but these bills have not gone through. And the bills that have gone through are those that support the relationship and support Israel. So we should be aware of that. Shouldn't be swept. Sometimes we're swept by the noise. I can say that President Biden was a good friend of Israel during the war with Hamas. He supported Israel. He rejected all kinds of resolutions that were raised at the UN and other international bodies. He acted out on his veto, and he gave Israel the time and space that it needed. So he proved himself, and it's not only, he's got a career of 40 years, 4 decades of friendship with Israel. So we're quite confident that we have a strong friendship. We have intimate discussions at the highest level all the time. And this just expressed itself in the fact, as you mentioned, that President Biden called the new government. I think that there'll be a lot of common ground of understanding between the new government and the Biden administration. There are issues of policy that we might find differences, like the JCPOA, or how to go forward in the process with the Palestinians, or peace process, normalization of relations. But it's fully legitimate to have differences of opinion. The only question is how you deal with these differences of opinion. And I can say that intimate discussions are going on at all levels, so I'm quite confident in the relationship.
Thank you so much. It's interesting when you're speaking about this new government. I was reading a quote today from Prime Minister Bennett. So he said, "This is not a day of mourning." Maybe you already saw this piece. "There's no disengagement here. There's no harm being caused to anyone. There's a change of government in a democracy. That's it." And he continues, "And I assure that it's a government that will work for the sake of the people." So when I read this, and you mentioned this in the beginning of your remarks, I'm still curious from your perspective, especially because of what you said and what we've seen in terms of the small majority, right? The really thin lines of being able to achieve any kinds of policy. What's your prediction in terms of accomplishments that you do see moving forward? And along those lines, we received many questions about the inclusion of the Arab contingency. Can you talk a little bit about the potential pros and risks of this inclusion?
Sure. Bennett is really groundbreaking situation that you have a prime minister who has such a small party, but he's brought together, a coalition, such a diverse coalition. Bennett's problem is that he has lost his base. His base were actually right-wing voters, and once he pledged during the campaign that he would not sit with Lapid, and he did. And for that reason, a large proportion of his base do not see him anymore as their leader, and therefore Bennett will have to look for a new base, which means that he'll have to link up with forces which are more centrist forces. And it also means that there'll be a large central force. There once was Kadima, which came in with a large number, but then disintegrated. And there's always been this demand for a centrist party, a centrist force between the Likud and the Labour, and between the Meretz and the far right. There was always this ambition or yearn for a central force. And there were different attempts which disintegrated. Kadima was the most successful, actually. And then there was Blue and White, but Blue and White also disintegrated. So now you've got a fragmentation of a few parties, which like the Bennett's party and Lieberman's party and Saar party. And I think they'll not be able to return to the Likud easily. So they'll have to form their new base. And that means that they'll work on, you talk about what are the accomplishments will have to be something that is agreed upon by all these diverse parties. So it cannot be moving, making big concessions in the peace process, or it can't be on the one hand annexing territory, but on the other hand, giving up territory. So you're talking about the more domestic issues. The accomplishments will be mainly in the field of the domestic issues like economy, tackling coronavirus, improving the internal domestic things in Israel. I think the diaspora-Israel relations might be one of the accomplishments, because the government is going to prioritize that. So I think the accomplishments will not be in the big, big security or foreign affairs issues. They'll be more in the domestic issues and things that enjoy a consensus. Like, for instance, normalization of relations with Arab states. Everyone will agree with on that, right? So that's something that the government can do. The Arab Party is, I see it as a very positive thing that an Arab party has come into the coalition, which means that you've got more integration of Israeli Arabs in society. I wrote my PhD on sectarianism, which is the phenomena of Jewish sects in the ancient period. And one of the findings was that in order to prevent a sect from becoming violent, you should try and keep them as much as possible in the center and close to the benefits of society. And that's why I think that, the ultra-Orthodox went through this trend of getting into integrating within the parliament system and part of Israeli society. And now the Arab Party, the Arabs always ran for the parliament, but they never belonged to the coalition. This is the first time that they're joining the coalition. And Mansour, who leads the Arab Party Ram, which went into the coalition, he stated that he's going against the tradition of the Arab Party, of the Joint List Party, and he's going for integration into the coalition. It was like a bone in the throat of the Arab Party. So now we're seeing more integration, and that has its effects. With time, the Israeli Arabs will feel more integrated. Now, we did have mob riots on the streets. We cannot forget that. They were incited. They were incited by the Hamas and by the more radical elements in the Palestinian Authority. We've seen outbreaks like that in the past, and in most cases, it takes a few days, weeks, but it subsides, and we go back to coexistence. So I believe that this will happen here as well.
So just to jump on that, thank you so much. Especially with the inclusion of the Arab Party in the coalition, what's your response, especially here in the diaspora and here in Los Angeles, where we hear so many, dare I say, so many Jews use words like apartheid and use words like occupation. I'm going to leave that question there, but I also am wondering if you'll speak to that idea of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, because that is certainly at the forefront in conversations and discussions today. And maybe you'll speak a little bit about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism and the backlash to that definition.
Sure. Well, that's quite an agenda.
I know. I'm sorry.
Look, when I see Jews or others, doesn't matter if they're Jews, Christians, or Muslim people, right? I see them demonstrating against Israel, calling for BDS, supporting Hamas, okay, in a battle between Israel and the Hamas, then I ask myself, how misguided can people be? How ignorant can they be? How can they be so misguided that they don't distinguish anymore between good and evil? I mean, it wasn't a fight between Israel and the Palestinians. It was a fight between Israel and the Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization that negates the state of Israel in any border. It's against a two-state solution. It doesn't recognize the agreements that was signed with the Palestinian Authority. It rejects the existence of the state of Israel. And you just have to read the charter of the Hamas to know that. They call for the annihilation of the state of Israel and the killing of Jews. So how ignorant can one be? And sometimes you can despair. You see such people that they don't know right, they don't know left from right, good from evil. So sometimes it's mind-boggling. When they say, the only thing I can say is that very often innocent people are swept up in trends, popular trends. And unfortunately, they should be thinking people that check the facts. They should check what instigated the violence and why. For instance, we know that Hamas started the attack. Israel did everything in its power in order to de-escalate and prevent the violence. But the Hamas had pre-planned it, instigated the violence for its own internal rivalry reasons with the Palestinian Authority. They pre-planned, pre-hoarded the rocks on the Temple Mount. They pelted rocks on the Muslim worshippers as well as Jewish worshippers. And they launched rockets and they pre-planned terrorist attacks. So how ignorant can you be and think that, it's Israel's fault? Israel's fault that Israel's attacked? You're changing the victim to the perpetrator. So people, unfortunately, I say this, people violate the most basic human rights by their so-called good intentions to care for human rights, just because of either they're ignorant or because they're misguided, or in worst cases, they're more sinister agendas. Regarding the definition of anti-Semitism, we have the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which states it clearly that the rejection of the state of Israel, or the anti-Zionist movement, like all those that go against the state of Israel, like BDS, is actually a form of anti-Semitism. And it's quite clear. It's another manifestation. It's a modern manifestation of the old classic anti-Semitism. It's become unpopular to hate Jews. So you hate the one and only Jewish state.
Right.
How is it so clear? Because criticism of Israel is accepted. I mean, you just need to go to Israel and you see that Israel is full of criticism. Israelis criticize Israel, criticize the policy from left, from right, from everywhere. There's no problem with criticism. But when people go beyond the line and they start calling for BDS, which is boycotting of Israel, or they demonize Israel, they single out Israel in a way that they don't do with any other country. I mean, they talk about one Palestinian injury is blown out of all proportion, and we're sorry about any injury or casualty on the Palestinian side, but they totally ignore millions of people displaced in Syria, 500,000 people killed in Syria, what's going on in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Iran, that they ignore. So there's a total bias, which is quite clear. So that's why we say that this type of a bias against Israel, demonizing of Israel, singling out of Israel, is anti-Semitism, and it should be clear. And those that sign petitions opposing the IRA definition, they're again misguided, ignorant, and they don't understand what's at hand.
So I mean, I so appreciate your passion. We are very much aligned, as you already know. But that being said, and you mentioned this in your beginning remarks, we're losing the PR campaign. So whether or not we hold so strongly that anti-Zionism, and again, I'm not saying criticism of Israel. First of all, criticism of Israel is what led to the democratic decision of this new coalition, right? That's what democracy is. What do we do about this PR campaign and PR battle here in Los Angeles, right in our own communities? Any guidance you can give our community and certainly give our Jewish leaders?
Yeah, look, with every battle that you have today, you have two fronts. You have the physical front and you have the PR, or the front, which is fighting for the hearts and minds of the people. And the Hamas and the Palestinian radicals wage the war on both fronts. We should not be mistaken. They just like they launch rockets, they launch also attacks against Israel for the hearts and minds, and they launch falsifications, lies, total lies. Right? They a terrorist organization, so they can release whatever they want. They have no accountability, and then we have to go out and prove that it's incorrect.
Yeah, right.
So we have a disadvantage. Before I go into the basic disadvantage, I would say also that the media is biased, and it's not that Israel doesn't have eloquent speakers. It's not that Israel doesn't release the information that is necessary, or release videos and clips of what's going on. Israel does, and Israel did. But the media stations decide what they air, what they broadcast, and what not, who they interview and who they don't interview. It's their decision. And you can see by every headline and every person they interview and what they show and what narrative they depict, what their opinion is. It's not, there's no real objective journalism anymore. And unfortunately, many of the media mainstream outlets are under this popular trend, popularism of some kind, and they take a narrative immediately without checking the truth. For instance, in this attrition with Hamas, many of the outlets released that the violence was triggered because Israel evicted Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And we all know that it's totally false. Israel didn't evict. It was a court case between private families where the court came to a ruling that the homes belonged to Jews, legally, documented legally. So a court gave a ruling. It wasn't the state of Israel evicting, and it wasn't Palestinians in their homes. It wasn't their homes, right? The court gave a ruling that they're illegal squatters. Now, this is released by AP, picked up by many of the media stations, and they don't check whether it's true or not, and they don't even bring an Israeli to portray the true narrative.
Any kind of balance.
Now, we're also in a disadvantage because when you're dealing with a terrorist organization that has no accountability, doesn't really care for the lives of the people, then you're in a disadvantage because Israel does everything in its power to prevent civilian casualties, while the terrorists, the Hamas, try their best to have civilian casualties, even from the Palestinian people. They launch from civilian populated areas against civilians, which is a double war crime. And to tell you the truth, while we mourn any Palestinian that is killed, they celebrate because it's a PR victory for them. So you're in a difficult situation when you have to fight falsifications with an organization that has no credibility. We base ourselves on credibility. So there's also a time lapse where they can release whatever they want. And until you prove that it's incorrect or what exactly happened, it takes time. So there is a basic disadvantage in a democracy that is fighting a terrorist organization.
So I'm also curious as our viewers about the rampant anti-Semitism and the rising anti-Semitism all over the US, all over the world, and what we've seen most recently in Los Angeles. If you could speak a little bit to that, any kind of guidance or comfort you can give us to the Jewish community about the security of the Jewish community, what we should be aware of. Predictions forward.
Yeah, well, look, I can't hide the fact that there's been a rise of anti-Semitism. It's documented, but all reports that come out documented and testify to it, whether it's the ADL or even the State Department reports that come out, we know that there's a rise of anti-Semitism. We also see it in front of our eyes, even here in LA, with the Jews being attacked on the streets, and graffiti on synagogues and vandalizing of kosher restaurants. We see it, we know it. My words of comfort to everyone is to say, first of all, one should be secure in one's ideology. One may pay a price for one's standing for values and for ideals. The Jews have paid a price throughout history, right, for being Jews. So standing to your values and perhaps even suffering because of that, that's part of our destiny, but that's part of our identity. And that's our value. That is us. We have to stand strong to our values, even if we pay a price. If we wouldn't be willing to pay that price, then the state of Israel would not have been established and the Jewish nation would have been wiped out many years ago. So that's part of our destiny. You can give theological reasons of why that is, right? You know, the sages already said that in every generation there will be those that hate Israel and try to annihilate and kill the people of Israel. We can go into theological reasons of why that is, but that is the fact. Another piece of comfort I can say is that now we have a state of Israel, which we didn't have in the past. We have a strong and secure state of Israel. And I, as a representative of the state of Israel here in LA, I stand for the Jewish community and I talk with the authorities and I talk to the LAPD and I talk to the mayor and I talk to those that are, so we are also bringing our clout in order to bring security, safety to the Jewish population. Another word of comfort I would say is that the authorities in the United States are wonderful, really. From my experience here, I can say that the elected officials, the mayor, the elected officials in general are standing strong with the Jewish community. There no reality like we had in the past where you had no one to turn to, no backing, no one to guard your back. Today we have that. We have that in the United States. We have LAPD, which is really dedicated to the safety and security of the Jewish community. And we can really find comfort in that. So you have the state of Israel supporting you and you have the LAPD and the authorities supporting you. That doesn't mean that you cannot guarantee that, you know, there'll be no attack. There were attacks and there will be attacks, but we must stand strong to our ideology and believe in our destiny. Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. We will prevail. And they might hit out at windows and even kill people sometimes. God forbid. But our will and our strength is much greater than that.
And I hope for those who are watching tonight that in you seeing this conversation, you feel that same kind of pride, and you also feel that same kind of connection to those values that have certainly stood the test of time. It's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation tonight, is to declare that we won't be afraid. No matter the rise of anti-Semitic attacks, we are very much encouraging our children, encouraging our congregation to continue wearing your kippah on the streets, continue to wear your Hamsa and your Chai and your Stars of David and whatever it may be that you do and show to represent your Jewish identity, to not be afraid. That's not who we are. I have some more questions, but I also want to give
Can I add one sentence?
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Newman, of course.
I'd just like to add one sentence and say that you also asked, what can people do? And I'd say that,
yes, please.
First of all, people should be active. People should be active on social media. The more the voice is heard of the group that is against anti-Semitism and against racism and getting the correct narrative across, that is very important. It's very important also for curbing the anti-Semitism. And please, the people should understand that the attacks on Jews on the streets in LA, indiscriminate attacks, is the same phenomena and manifestation of attacks against Israelis in Israel. And they should not allow a wedge to be drawn between Israel and the Jewish population. They should stand with Israel when Israel is attacked, and I assure you that Israel will stand with the Jews when they're attacked, even when they're not attacked.
Thank you. A few questions are coming through. And I know you touched upon this. I'm wondering if you can put this as part of your answer. So Chloe Levian, one of our Sinai Temple members and a UCLA student, she and part of Bruins for Israel, she said the UCLA, as we just saw, the UCLA student government had 7 resolutions/statements about Israel on their agenda. During a public comment, anti-Zionists said, "This is not a conflict, it's apartheid." So how would you respond to this? But I'm going to add to that, because Dr. Newman, you said for those who are on social media to make sure that you have an informed approach. Where do you recommend, and this might be a hard one, and I don't know if you're allowed to say, where do you recommend those who are in their 20s and 30s students get their information? Are you able to offer some of those resources? So how do you respond to that statement? This is not a conflict, it's apartheid. And what are your recommendations for resources, especially for millennials that are really facing this PR battle on Instagram, Facebook, etc.?
Yeah, we are aware of the resolutions. And again, this is trendy, it's popular amongst the students. You know, Pans, we were very concerned about the students on campus. We thought we were losing the second generation. Mm-hmm. Especially during the Intifada years, for instance, when Israel had to battle the Palestinians on several fronts, and there was violence, and there was military intervention. And we were concerned. We heard then that the students on campuses are against Israel, and we're concerned about the next generation. But, you know, even those students of the Intifada years, they grew up, they graduated, they become adults, and then they understand. They understand the issues, they understand who's their enemy, who's the ally, who preserves and upholds the values and who does not. Now, in the issue of, unfortunately, the students sometimes are swept up very innocently and naively, and they don't understand the issues. Like, for instance, apartheid. Apartheid is a slogan, but it's an empty slogan when you refer to Israel. Israel is the only democracy in the entire Middle East. Israel is the only country where the Christian population flourishes and grows. Israel is the one and only country where you have true freedom of all minority groups, civil rights for all minority groups. We just mentioned that the Arab Party was the 3rd largest party in the parliament in the previous Knesset. Today, because they split into 2 parties, they have a bit less members of parliament, but they're the kingmaker in the government of Israel. They made the government. So how can you dream? I mean, look at every Middle Eastern country around Israel. Where do you find such a situation? A Jewish party. Where can LGBTQ rights, where are they upheld? Only in Israel. From every aspect of what we call progressive values, Israel is a beacon, a leader, a pioneer women's status, LGBTQ rights, every aspect, minority rights. So we do have the issue of the Palestinians. Agreed, the Palestinians they didn't want to be citizens of Israel. They didn't accept citizenship of Israel. Therefore, they belong to a separate entity. Israel's, together with the Palestinian Authority, we've set up a separate entity. They have Palestinian passports. So you can't come and, you can't attack Israel from both sides. You can't come and say, oh, they don't want to be citizens of Israel, but they should have full rights as citizens of Israel. If they're not citizens of Israel, then they don't have the full rights as citizens of Israel, just like any other country in the world. People from Portugal, they don't have the same rights as an American citizen. They don't have a green card, and they don't have the same social security as an American citizen. That's how the world works. So the singling out of Israel in the Palestinian context is either from ignorance, or people who are misguided, or it's misleading, deceiving people on purpose. So that's my answer about the apartheid. Regarding where people can get their information, I would say, first of all, you should always be updated. The question is where you get your information from, right? So you should be careful who is feeding you your information and your narrative. You should know that Israel bases itself on credibility, and therefore Israel will never, on purpose, deliberately feed you misinformation. And I guarantee that. I, here as a representative of the State of Israel, I can tell you we work with the public diplomacy of Center of Public Diplomacy and the Prime Minister's Office of Israel, which sends out the information and the clips and the videos. They will never, never send out something which is false or deceiving in any way. You can make a mistake sometime. You can send out something real time, which later on you find that it's a different context, but it will never be done deliberately. So I would say to people, follow our sites, follow the Prime Minister's Office, follow the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, follow the public diplomacy, the IDF of Israel. You hear a different view, fine. You can always turn to us and ask questions. We're open for any question. And I said again, we will never deceive. We will only tell the truth, even if it hurts. If a Palestinian was killed, we will look into the facts, check what happened, and if Israel, God forbid, killed him and he was a civilian, we will say so. We will say what the context was. You won't get that truth from the Hamas. The Hamas will immediately say Israel is at fault without even knowing. 20% of the rockets that were launched from the Gaza Strip against Israel fell short and killed Palestinians. So when they show a picture of a Palestinian casualty, how do you know whether that Palestinian casualty was killed by Israel or by a Palestinian rocket? The only way you'll know is if you check Israel's sites, because Israel will say whether it was by the hands of Israel or by the hands of a Palestinian rocket.
So I have a question here about the northern branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Could you speak about its practical significance?
Yeah, we have radical elements within the Israeli Arab society, especially those that adhere to the more radical elements of the Muslim Brotherhood. We've had normalization of relations with Arab states like Sudan, Morocco, Bahrain, UAE. And you ask why? And the answer is, first of all, they understood that Israel is an ally and not an enemy. It took them a few decades, but at last they understood. The second thing is that they understand who the enemy is. And the enemy is they despise the Muslim Brotherhood because they know where they stand. The Muslim Brotherhood, together with Iran and the radical elements in the Shiite and Sunni world, are out to topple their regimes. They're out against any moderate regime. So the Muslim Brotherhood is an extreme radical organization which incites and spreads terrorism. And there are elements within the Israeli Arab population that adhere to this incitement. It's unfortunate, but the vast majority are not. And even in this, when there was incitement and the Israeli Arabs arose, some of them, and rioted, it was not the majority. And the leaders of the Arab Israeli community, like mayors, municipality leaders, came out against the violence and called them to stay home and not riot in the streets. So we should understand that there are strong elements which support coexistence within the Israeli Arab community. We must understand that. We get swept again by the violence and by the noisy groups. But the mainstream majority are not supporting. They support the coexistence.
Well, then along those lines, so that's you speaking about the support of coexistence within Israel itself, and you mentioned the number of states outside of Israel beginning to normalize relations. And I'm curious, I had one question actually speaking about China's relationship with Israel, as well as China's relationship to Iran. So I'm wondering if you could speak about that complex situation, and if you have other predictions of foreign states that you see possibly coming on the horizon in terms of a future ally of Israel.
Sure. Let me start off with the issue of the normalizing of relations, and I'll just say that in that aspect, that this is very significant. And if it's significant, first of all, because it's going to be a warm peace. The peace with UAE, Bahrain is going to be very warm. And you can just see that if you just follow social media, you follow statements coming out from the leadership of UAE and Bahrain. And it's so different to the past. So, there was
unbelievable to follow. It's unbelievable. Yeah. It's hard to imagine that we exist in a time, as you are explaining it, to see that warm relationship actually take place on social media. I didn't mean to interrupt, but it feels quite miraculous to witness something like that.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And the people-to-people contacts that are being formed and cultivated, and the economic activity, that's going to instill the warmth and the real friendship. Because what happened with Egypt and Jordan, unfortunately, is that it was a peace signed on paper, but it had no real manifestation in the popular eyes. And the parliament was against, and the popular trend was against. So there was no real relationship. And then this brings me to tell you to tell those who are watching a story. There's an Arab singer who met with Omer Adam, Israeli singer, and they took a photo together. And then that Egyptian singer, he went back to Egypt. And he was attacked in Egypt. How did you dare take a photo with an Israeli singer, Omer Adam? And he had to justify himself, and he started to engage in all kinds of apologetics, that he didn't really know who it was, and someone took the picture. He did that because he was going to lose support and lose his career in Egypt. Now, the story of that picture is that it was taken in United Arab Emirates, where Omer Adam was invited to give public performances, including in the Sheikh's palace. And the Egyptian singer was there, and the picture was taken there. So you see the gap, the unbridgeable gap here, maybe. What happens in Egypt, because he took a photo with an Israeli singer, and what happens in United Arab Emirates, where they invite, as in, an honorable guest, the Israeli singer. So we're talking about a new situation. The second thing, which is very significant about the normalization, is the breaking of the taboo against Israel. It is true that Egypt and Jordan broke the taboo many years ago, but it was seen more like a ceasefire. It wasn't really seen as a true peace. The peace now with United UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco is a breaking of the Arab League resolution of taboo against Israel, because they don't have a real border confrontation with Israel. They don't really have a situation of war. So we're moving from cold relations to warm, peaceful relations. And that's a big breaking of the taboo. And that's why the Hamas is so against this breaking of the taboo. It also breaks the paradigm of giving something for peace. In the past, Israel always had to pay a price for the other side to just recognize Israel. Now we don't. It's peace for peace. It's breaking of that territories for peace, or Israel paying a price. It's peace for peace, which is a new reality. Predictions for the future. Look, we had a few countries that were in line on what we call the shortlist for peace in the future. We don't name their names because we don't want to make the decision for them or put them in a difficult situation. We wait for them to make the decision, feel the time is right to declare the peace. We knew, for instance, with UAE and Bahrain that it was coming, but we didn't say a word. We waited. I myself visited UAE on a very confidential visit together with the foreign minister in 2019. It was 1 month before I started my mission here in Los Angeles. And we had talks at the highest level, but it was all kept confidential because that was what they wanted. So that was kept till the moment they declared the normalizing of relations. And now everything wonderfully so is open and transparent. So we can't talk about the countries or name their names, but there is a short list of a few countries that are in line. It will depend, though, on the policy towards Iran, the United States administration's policy towards the JCPOA and regional things, and their wish list with the United States and the Western world. So there are many factors that play in, and it's also their concerns. Their concerns with the Arab Street, their concerns with Iran, that Iran might attack them. That is their gravest concern. They don't have any doubt about the relations with Israel. Their doubts are what will be the ramifications, what will be their damage. You know, one attack against a tanker or an oil mine can be billions of dollars. So who's going to defend their interests? Who's going to compensate them? These are issues which are on the table when you talk about peace. What else did you ask? I think you.
I did ask about China.
China.
We have about 2 more minutes. And I know everyone who's watching, because I could stay on for another half hour, would probably want us to continue, but I know we have to end by 8. But maybe we'll just. Can we add a minute on China? Can we add a minute on China?
Okay. China is an important nation and state, and we have signed very important agreements with China, especially in the field of innovation. We've signed very significant agreements with China. At the same time, we are wary of their investments and the monopoly of China. And therefore, we have set up a committee which monitors investments of China. And the committee has to approve or disapprove anything that is done with China. So we are wary of their control, not giving them too much monopoly. But at the same time, we see the importance of the relations with China as an upcoming country, which is a country not to be ignored, and relations must be cultivated with China.
Thank you. Dr. Newman, any kind of final thoughts after that rapid fire covering of so many different topics, of which we are so grateful of your time? Any final thoughts for our community tonight?
I'd just like to say to the community that I know it's a community which upholds the Jewish values and is dedicated and committed to the state of Israel. And therefore, on behalf of the state of Israel, I'd like to express our appreciation for the dedication of every single community leader and community member for their dedication and commitment to these values. I'd like to express deep appreciation to Rabbi Wolpe and you, Rabbi Guzik, and the entire team, spiritual leadership of this community, for your capable leadership, leading the community in the right direction with the right values. And for that, we are indebted to you. And on behalf of the state of Israel, I wish everyone good health, prosperity, and may everyone come out of the Corona era, as we are coming out right now, to a new future of health and prosperity.
Dr. Newman, thank you so much. On behalf of Sinai Temple and the Sinai Temple Israel Center, we thank you. We thank the consulate, as well as Carolyn Ben-Atan, our own Rebecca Small, and Roy Regev for helping to put together this evening's conversation. And if I can just make a plug to our own Sinai Temple community, and I hope that you will be also comforted by this, Dr. Newman, we are planning an Israel trip for next summer. I was probably a little premature announcing that, but we are very excited to go back home and to be in the land of Israel, which is so deeply embedded in each of our hearts. And so with that, we thank you so much for this incredible briefing, of which I will say is to be continued, because clearly this is just the beginning of many conversations between Sinai Temple, our Israel Center, and you, our esteemed educator, representative. We are so privileged to have you as our leader here in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Very much.
Good night, everyone.